Morning, everybody. Hey, thank you. But before we talk about my birthday, there is another one in the church. Well, he has left our church, and he has gone off to have a wife and other people. And I think we should also make sure that we remind Mark and Tracy and Janet and JL to make sure to work. Wish, thank you, that's the word. Thanks, wife. To wish Caleb McLean a happy birthday tomorrow also. So, he's my twin of a little bit younger age. We want to thank him for that. All right. I would like everybody who is wearing a blue shirt that says high-powered on it to stand up real quick, please. And anybody else who happened to help out who's not wearing a blue shirt. Give these people a round of applause, please. Not only did they have to deal with my kids, but they had to deal with a lot of other kids. Also, one of my kids, I thought he was going to be standing here. Apparently he took off, though. It was his first year to help out, and that was pretty awesome. So, anyway, I just wanted to thank you guys for what you did over the last week. I am really happy it wasn't super hot for you like it's going to be today. So there's a blessing, right? All right. Well, today we're going to be wrapping up our summer in Psalms. And this is Psalm 94. At first, I thought I was going to have to do Psalm 93. And I was looking at that over and over. I was like, how am I going to make 5 verses into a 30 to 35-minute sermon? Kudos to Ken for doing that, and that was a great message, by the way, last week. And I want to mention a few things from it throughout today. But then I realized, I have Psalm 94. How am I going to manage to make this into a 40 to 45-minute psalm? Just kidding, or sermon, just kidding, it'll be lower. All right. It'll be shorter, yes, it'll be shorter, lower, whatever you want to say. So last week, Ken talked about the God who reigns in might. And we're going to see that this week also, but we're also going to see the God, wow, I can't talk today. The God who reigns in righteousness and faithfulness and with justice. True justice, that is. So Ken also talked about living in a world with constant change. And today I want to talk about living in a world that is fallen, corrupt, and evil. We live in a world where we see atrocities committed every day, both individually and corporately by groups of people. We can think of Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme that defrauded billions from investors. We can think about the way that the Chinese treat the Uyghurs. Or maybe Joseph Kony and the way the Lord's Resistance Army, who claim to want to form a Christian state in Uganda and South Sudan and Kenya and Congo. But what they do is they go and they kidnap children. They kill their parents. They sell those children into sex trafficking, and they make them become child soldiers. In our own country, we have elected officials who give subsidies and tax breaks to organizations and even to foreign nations, who then they take that tax money and they funnel it back into the foundations by the senator or other elected official. In a sense, making both of those groups rich at others' expenses. Corruption and evil run rampant in the world, and while most will try to hide it, some even flaunt what they do. They brag about it, and their actions and words should fill us with indignation and a righteous anger. And our writer in Psalms today is going to express that. Last week, Ken mentioned the raging seas as metaphorically depicting the nations that rise up against God, and they're making sounds against him. They're yelling at him. They're trying to shout him down in his laws. And so many times in the Old Testament, the nations are seen as a judgment upon Israel for when Israel tries to do that, when they sin, and they're being used as a punishment against Israel. But the nations that do this are always considered to be a boastful and arrogant group of people. And God promises punishment upon them for the way that they end up treating Israel. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Canaanites, and the Moabites. And Israel itself is constantly being reproved by God for following other gods and for the way that they treat the other Israelites who do not have as much power in their nation. And while some Psalms and some books of the prophets look to the destruction of other nations, numerous chapters and verses throughout those same books call out Israel for being sinful. And I want to mention that because if you look at Psalm 94, you might look at it as a punishment of other nations. Like this might be what's going to happen, these other nations. But when you get into it, Psalm 94 is, the psalmist is looking for destruction against the wicked. He's calling upon God to take care of those who are doing evil in Israel. The first 7 verses say, O Lord, the God who avenges, O God who avenges, shine forth. Rise up, O judge of the earth, pay back to the proud what they deserve. How long will the wicked, O Lord, how long will the wicked be jubilant? They pour out arrogant words, all the evildoers are full of boasting. They crush your people, O Lord, they oppress your inheritance. They slay the widow and the alien. They murder the fatherless. They say, the God of Jacob takes no notice. The God of Jacob pays no heed. For some of us, this may look like the image of the God who avenges. But as we know, Thor is not a god. And according to the MCU, he has a long life, but he is mortal. But I titled this sermon, The God of Righteous Vengeance. A couple of commentaries I read mentioned how titles of sermons of this passage nowadays might lean towards the God who punishes, because vengeance is a loaded word as English has evolved. But even today, the word punishment still has this terrible connotation. We don't want to use the word punishment. It's almost a 4-letter word because we're too weak to uphold the laws that we have and actually punish people who are guilty. We see abusers get out of jail and on bail, and the next day they go and kill their wife or their girlfriend. We see people who are arrested 3 times in a day with stolen property. We're not upholding laws, and that should make us angry. It should make us be indignant with a righteous indignation. Crimes need to be punished and wrongs remedied and laws are upheld. If you look through Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, they all have laws that God gave to his people, and they must be upheld. That's what God says. He says you must take care of what is wrong, and he puts people in charge of upholding those laws, to act according to his word. But just like now, they didn't do that all the time either in Israel. The psalmist here is crying out to God for that. Now, this is the only time in the Old Testament when God is called the God of vengeance, when it's actually used as a title like that. We hear about his vengeance a lot, especially throughout the prophets. When he calls out to God to shine forth, he is calling out to God to show his majesty, his righteousness, because God's glory is shown in his righteousness and in his just treatment of sin. I want to pause here for a second so we can understand the word avenge that's used here. It doesn't mean seeking retribution emotionally. That's revenge. Revenge is when I want to punish somebody personally and hurt them for something that they did to me. Like if my wife was killed by a drunk driver, I wouldn't go and find that person's house and burn it down and kill his children. What I would do to avenge that, to do what is right in that situation, is I would help the police find the person who did it, gather up evidence, whatever I could do, so that the police could arrest him and treat this person with the accordance to the law. Not what I think should be done to that person. The psalmist here is looking for God's law to be upheld, for punishment to be dealt to the wicked, not just because it is right, but look at the attitudes of what these people have. Verse 2, they're proud, jubilant in verse 3. They are arrogant and boastful in verse 4. And the word for jubilant here also means to rejoice. It's translated as that, and to leap for joy, and to shout with laughter. That's what these evil people have as their attitude. That their sin, what they're doing to other people, is okay, and they can get away with it happily. And here are their arrogant words in verse 7. Yahweh doesn't see. The God of Jacob pays no attention. They stand in the sight of others and defy God. They boast in ignorance as they make themselves mightier than he. If you look back at verse 2, the psalmist is calling on God to rise up. Don't let this go on any longer. It seems to have been going on forever, and it doesn't seem to have an end. Now, for us, how many times does that seem, like what Josh was mentioning? It seems like the wicked things seem to go on and on and on, and there doesn't appear to be an end to it. The psalmist is calling on God to do this because he is fed up with what he sees as wrong. Last week we saw that God's statutes and his words, his laws stand firm. And he is mightier than those who oppose him, those who try to thunder at him, those who scream at God and try to shout him down. The psalmist here calls on God, the judge of the earth, echoing the words of Abraham when he was asking God to spare Sodom and Gomorrah. And in the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, 35 through 36. And in his song, as the Israelites prepared to go into the promised land, he says, the Lord will repay them their evil. When they stray, he will judge them. They spoke the truth, and the psalmist is calling upon God to fulfill that truth. In verse 5 and 6, we can see that the case that the psalmist brings before the judge. They crush God's people, they oppress his inheritance, they slay the widow and the alien, and they murder the fatherless. He is calling upon God to bring vengeance for those people. The word inheritance is really used first of Israel when Moses takes that second set of stone tablets back up the mountain after the whole incident with the golden calf thing, when he lost his temper, righteously so. In Exodus 34, 8 through 10, he asks this of God. It says, Moses bowed down to the ground at once and worshipped. Lord, he said, if I have found favor in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. Then the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. These people who you live among, will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. Israel is referred to as God's inheritance numerous times throughout the Psalms and prophets. More times than not in Psalms, when Israel is referred to God's inheritance, it's a good thing. Yay! Most of the time in the prophets, when the people are referred to as God's inheritance, it's a bad thing because he's going to punish Israel for defiling his inheritance. God is usually upset with them during those times. And the psalmist here is calling on God to remember his inheritance, to stand up for them, to relieve their oppression by their own people. And his case is based on these laws. In Exodus 22, starting in verse 21, says, "You must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress him, since you were foreigners in Egypt. You must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry out to me. And I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless." Deuteronomy 24, starting in verse 17, God says this, "Do not deny justice to a foreigner or fatherless child, and do not take a widow's garment as security. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I am commanding you to do this. When you reap the harvest of the field and you overlook a sheaf, don't go back to go get it. Leave it for the foreigner, for the fatherless, and for the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your work of all your hands. When you knock down the fruit of the olive tree, you must not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you must not glean what is left. What remains will be for who? The foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, therefore I am commanding you to do this." Deuteronomy 10, starting in verse 12. "And now now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you, except to fear the Lord your God by walking in all his ways, to love him, to worship the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Keep the Lord's commands and statutes I am giving you today for your own good. The heavens, indeed the highest heavens, belong to the Lord your God, as does the earth and everything in it. Yet the Lord was devoted to your fathers and loved them. He chose their descendants after them." That's the inheritance. "He chose you out of all the peoples as it is today. Therefore, circumcise your hearts and do not be stiff-necked any longer. For the Lord your God is the God of God, the Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, showing no partiality and taking no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow. He loves the foreigner, giving him food and clothing. You must also love the foreigner, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt." When we read through the books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Malachi, we see that Israel deserves punishment for breaking these laws over and over. In verse 7, these evildoers say Yahweh doesn't see. The God of Jacob pays no heed. And I think it's really important to notice this, because the covenant God Yahweh, the one who gave these commands, who promises these things to Israel, doesn't see. He doesn't pay attention. That's what they say. The God of Jacob, the man from whom the inheritance of God came from. The psalmist focuses God's direction to the law and to the promise, which these people scorn and say, God doesn't do anything. He says, God, this is what they say. Take a look at what they say, because you know that's not true. He brings the case to God and says, look at what they despise. They despise your words, Lord. If it was possible, they would take God's glory and his majesty from him. That's how arrogant these people are. And then the psalmist changes focus. He's no longer addressing God. He addresses the people. And while his direction is at those who are continuing to do these injustices, it is a warning, and it's also a comfort for us. He asks 5 questions in these next 4 verses. And the first is not completely a rhetorical question. When will you fools become wise? I mean, the general answer to that is these fools are not going to become wise, right? But it's to get them to realize that what they're doing, their attitude of God not paying attention or listening, is about to be shattered in the next 4 verses. So in verse 8, it says, "Take heed, you senseless ones among the people. You fools, when will you become wise? Does he who implanted the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see? Does he who disciplined nations not punish? Does he who teaches man lack knowledge? The Lord knows the thoughts of man. He knows that they are futile." These questions are designed to lead up to that last point right there. You know the answers to all these questions. And even if you try to deny it, it's there in your heart. These people know the answer, but they want to ignore it. They want to get away from it if they can. The question points back to what these people have said. They said that God doesn't see and that he pays no heed. Well, he's the one who created the ear. How could he not hear? He's the one who created eyes. Of course he can see. He pays attention, and he hears the cries when people are being oppressed. He's told Israel that throughout the Torah. Now, the next question isn't addressing something these people have done or said, but it's very likely they have witnessed it or they've been taught it, which they should have been if Israel was doing the right thing and teaching laws and statutes. The question about punishing nations. Now, it's likely that this psalm was actually written during the time of Isaiah or Jeremiah, and the Israelites would have been fully aware of what had just very recently happened to Assyria, who oppressed them. Well, they were destroyed by the Babylonians. Some people think it may have been written a little bit later, after they returned from exile. And they might be thinking about how the Persians defeated the Babylonians, who God had promised punishment upon them. Whenever it was written, the Israelites would have known that God punishes those who are evil, especially those who oppress his inheritance, including the foreign nations. The section concludes with, "Your thoughts he knows, your actions he sees, and they will not lead to fruition." Nothing good will result in the end. Maybe you'll get away with it for a little while, but God sees it, and he knows it, and the walls are going to eventually come crumbling down on you. Verses 12 through 15 say this: "Blessed is the man you discipline, O Lord, the man you teach from your law. You grant them relief from days of trouble, till a pit is dug for the wicked. For the Lord will not reject his people. He will never forsake his inheritance. Judgment will again be founded on righteousness, and all the upright in heart will follow it." How many of you have ever told your child, "I know what you're thinking"? We know what they're thinking sometimes, right? You can see it on their face. Whether it's joy, usually we don't have to say, "I know what you're thinking," you're happy. Usually what we have to say is, you're angry about something, you're feeling shame about something, you're disappointed. Something like that. We can see it in their face. How much more does God know those things about everyone he created? We can't hide it from him. And I want you to keep with the thought of children now, because how many of you as a parent have told your kids, "Why I'm punishing you"? How many of you have ever done that? "I'm punishing you because this behavior is not right. You need to learn from it." I do that to my kids, and I can tell you, I really hated it when my parents did it to me. It was not a fun lecture. I'm sure that my kids don't like it either. They don't feel it's fair. And they might not necessarily understand it the first 10 times you tell them why you're punishing them over and over the course of a year or two. But I will tell you this. There was one day when Asher, I don't remember where we were. I think it was the aquatic park. It doesn't really matter. But he was about 5, maybe 6, and he saw a kid just pitching a fit. And he had this look on his face and he looked at me and goes, "Dad, that kid needs to be in trouble." Parenting win right there, I tell you what. Oh, I was so proud. And probably about an hour later, I had to discipline about something else. But that was a great moment, I will tell you what. So, we know that the righteous are blessed. Those who are disciplined are also blessed. We may not like it at the time, but it turns us back from what we were doing. It turns us back to God. That is an incredible blessing right there. The word for disciplined right here is the Hebrew word yasar. The majority of the times that it gets translated, it means to be corrected, punished, or scourged. It also means to be taught, but with the idea of corrective training, not 2 + 2 is 4. It's a way that you learn from your errors, from your mistakes, from your sins, from the wrong that you've done. God brings us back, in that sense, to teach us and correct us. Now, while God has taught us, and we are blessed by that, we have also fallen short. So when we do fall short, that correctiveness, it might sting, but it's a blessing because we're brought back to Him. None of us like having our parents disappointed or mad at us because of what we've done. Right? Okay. I mean, maybe you do, but I sure don't. My kids don't. But how much worse when God is disappointed in us? But how much better is it when we're corrected? And He's not disappointed in us again. Yeah, all right. So here's a blessing from God's corrective teaching. It's in verse 13. We have relief from trouble. Not that we've had bad times or that we struggle, but we have comfort in God sustaining us. We don't have to worry about what happened to us, but the evil do. So starting in verse 13, it says, not verse 13. Yes, I'm going back to verse 13. It says, the Lord will not reject His people. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. You grant him relief from days of trouble till a pit is dug for the wicked. The wicked have to fear God, and they are digging a pit for themselves. If you remember from Psalm 88 what the pit looked like, it was the grave, it was death. The evil are facing that without hope in God. So as we see this, the struggle the psalmist is speaking about, he gives us hope in that while evil is going on in Israel, and it happens today, we, His people, don't have to worry. Israel, the righteous, God's true inheritance, those who follow Him, will not be forsaken. And I love this part. Justice will be founded on righteousness, not on social decrees. I mean, Nazi Germany had social decrees. Venezuela has social decrees. The U.S. has laws and social decrees. So does Saudi Arabia. Some of these are definitely not based on what God's will is. He's given them and us the ability to put laws into effect, but our laws sometimes do not coincide with what God wants. And it's a good thing that punishment sometimes is not dealt out by us. Because I can tell you, I am not nearly as patient as God. It would be a terrible thing if I got to set justice upon everybody who I wanted to. It would not be righteous. It would not be holy necessarily. It would not necessarily be deserved. But God's justice is. Justice is in his hands, and we who are upright will follow his justice. And it may for us look like our psalmist is the psalmist is saying, hey God, it's taking too long to get to that point. I don't really want to keep on waiting on this. Now wouldn't this be kind of a great end though to this psalm at the end of verse 15? The upright will follow him. Some scholars have tried to say that this actually is two psalms put together. There's not a lot of evidence for it in the Septuagint or the Masoretic text. But we see a change of view, and that's where people kind of get this idea. Maybe there's two psalms here. The psalmist puts himself now into the picture. We had God as judge. We had the case that was brought forward against the unrighteous. And now the psalmist is putting himself here. He makes it personal. Starting in verse 16, he says, "Who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against the evildoers? Unless the Lord has given me help, I would soon have dwelt in the shadow of death." Silence of death, sorry. "When I said my foot is slipping, your love, O Lord, supported me. When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought joy to my soul." He puts himself there against those who are evil. He's taking a stand and he's speaking God's truth. And he says, I can't do this without your help. Now, who helps him? It's Yahweh, the God who promised hundreds of years before this was written that he would uphold his words. The psalmist is saying, hey, I'm going to help you hold your words, but you have to uphold me because I can't do this without you. He's bringing it to the people saying, hey, this is not right. God, help me out here because I can't do it without you. The psalmist sees the things that are wrong and he struggles with it. It eats at him. He's worried. How many of us, when we put in the place of calling something wrong, we worry about it? When we're put in that place, you got to say, hey, you're not doing something right. How many of us worry about how we're going to say that? Or what the reaction's going to be? Or if we're going to get hurt by it. We might be putting ourselves in front of 50 people who are doing the wrong thing. I mean, how scary can that be? The psalmist here, though, he relies on God. That's what we do. That's what we need to do. We may be outnumbered by the unrighteous and the wicked, and that's what the spot that this writer is in. But unlike Haman from Psalm 88, the writer of this psalm is comforted, and we see God's support, which makes this a whole lot more uplifting. Look at verse 19. Your consolation brought joy to my soul. How many of you have ever wondered, have that wonderful feeling when you're anxious and when you're worried, and then eventually God takes that away from you. You pray about it, and that feeling just goes away. That's an amazing feeling right there, right? Just that weight lifted from you. That's what's happening to the psalmist here. It's not the end of the psalm, and it's not necessarily the thing that I'm going to be stressing is that part right there, but that feeling of comfort is incredible. God gives us peace in times of strife. And I almost feel like we could put a little Selah right there, a little pause and reflect on that. So I want to stop talking for about 5 seconds here. I want you to think about a time in your life when you felt that consolation, when you felt God's joy, before I start to wrap this up. Enjoy that memory. So the last 4 verses show the polar extremes of our righteous and just God versus those who despise him. And it brings to conclusion the first verse we looked at. The God who reigns in might justice, faithfulness, and with righteousness. The living God who avenges the sins of those who stand against him. It says, can a corrupt throne be allied with you, one that brings on misery by his decrees? They band together against the righteous and condemn the innocent to death. But the Lord has become my fortress and my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. He will repay them for their sins and destroy them for their wickedness. The Lord our God will destroy them. Now the first verse in these final verses, it's a rhetorical question. Of course, a holy God cannot stand with those who are corrupt and unjust. Unjust laws and decrees, those which condemn the weak and the powerless, will not be tolerated by God. Those who try will be repaid for their crimes and their sins. Those who distort God's truth, those who seek to bring harm upon those who are righteous, and those who want to exploit the powerless, those who rebel against God. In every way, they will be destroyed. Their sins will be repaid upon them no matter how powerful they think they are. Whatever words they use to bolster themselves during their life, they will not succeed in the face of a perfect God. If you look at verse 21, you see that these people are joining together. It's not just individuals in certain situations. It's a band of people doing this. Think of the politicians and the organizations that I mentioned earlier. We don't have a throne in our country, but we have those who make laws. David Guzik says this: wickedness can be found in high places. Some thrones are marked with iniquity, and some laws are devised by evil. Such will never fellowship with God. Those in Israel at this time were standing up against God's true people, his inheritance, and they try to obliterate the innocent and the righteous. They shout down and persecute those who know the truth and God's law, his word. Yahweh, the covenant God, is going to repay them for that. And thank goodness for that. And while this is a great truth, I want us to leave with this. The psalmist may see this taking a long time to happen. Punishment isn't necessarily being doled out right away. And this can reassure us and lift us up today. The psalmist, instead of calling on them for them to be destroyed, leaves everything to God. He's not taking it upon himself. He's leaving it with God, and that's what we need to do. Not just the punishment for the wicked, though. He's giving himself and his situation to God to take care of. This is for us to take solace in. God, the rock, our refuge, our salvation, is our fortress. While we may experience evil and we may face persecution and we may have to take a stand against those things which God condemns, we are supported and comforted by him. Our Lord Jesus, our rock, our fortress, was crucified, he died, he rose again, and we know that this is true. And we are secure knowing that our faith in his blood, we will soon be freed from the evil of this world, the evil of men. We will be with our Father forever because he has called us to be his inheritance, which God will not forsake, nor will he reject.